Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the 1990s. So last week we talked about the 1980s, and today we're going to go ahead and move into our next decade. And again, we're going to start with the Soviet Union. So remember, communism was a big thing during the Cold War, and by the late 1980s, the communist systems in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union were starting to collapse. They couldn't provide their people with the things that they needed, so they started to protest. Remember, under a communist system, the government promises to provide you with everything you need in exchange for giving up your rights. Well, they couldn't give them what they needed anymore. And so by 1989, we start seeing these huge widespread protests where people are demanding their rights and an end to communism. So these light red countries right here, these were all countries that they were independent countries, but they had to do what the Soviet Union said. So remember, East Germany over here, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia. And you can see the dates here are the dates that communism collapsed in those countries and they became democratic. The red, the dark red over here, these all used to be part of the Soviet Union. And by 1991, they had all decided, you know what, we are not cool with being part of the Soviet Union anymore. And eventually, they all slowly gained their own independence. And this was a huge moment because the Cold War was a defining feature of the second half of the 20th century. Okay. The internet also became a huge thing in the 1990s. Right? So the internet was actually developed by the U.S. military, something called ARPANET. Okay, this is Defense Advanced Research Program, and the goal was to find a way to communicate between all sorts of universities and research centers throughout the United States. And by the 1990s, it had become accessible to it had become more popular to people in the United States. And people start using it for things like email or instant messengers, which we know as DMs today, right? A way to get news and financial advice and things like that. And it was a way for people to connect. It allowed people to access this information almost instantaneously. Now, at first, the internet was very, very slow. So when I first got the internet in my house, you weren't really streaming anything because, well, the internet just couldn't go that fast. In 1998, Google is going to step onto the scene as they're going to start a search engine, which was a way for for people who use the internet to find information on the website. And now we know Google as probably one of the most important parts of the internet. I mean, it even has its own verb to Google something, right? A major war breaks out at the beginning of the 90s. This is known as the First Gulf War. So here we have the country of Iraq, and Iraq decided Iraq wasn't really getting along with its neighbors. It didn't trust Saudi Arabia or Iran, and they decided that in August 2nd, 1990, that they're going to invade Kuwait, and that's exactly what they did. Well, the world saw this as unacceptable, and the United States goes to the UN and says, we need to condemn Iraq for this, and that's exactly what the United Nations does. So remember we talked about the General Assembly was all the countries, but the Security Council, they're the ones with all the teeth, right? And all the 5 permanent members, the US, UK, France, China, and Russia could veto any resolution. Remember, at the time it was the Soviet Union still in 1990. And the Security Council condemned that and said, look, Iraq, if you don't get your act together and you don't get out of Kuwait, we're going to let other countries go to war with you. And every single member except for Iraq voted for this resolution, and Iraq said, bring it on. And so the United States did just that. And they sent 700,000 troops to liberate or free Kuwait and defend Saudi Arabia. The war is actually quite short. The American military proved why it was the strongest, most powerful, most feared in the world, because even though Iraq launches their invasion on August 2nd, by February 28th, just a few months later, the United States had managed to liberate Kuwait. Now, there was debate over whether or not they should go to Baghdad and arrest Saddam Hussein, who was the leader of Iraq at the time. And they decided not to. And instead, what they did was they banned Iraq from flying planes in northern Iraq and southern Iraq and prevented them from amassing soldiers along the border. Here in the United States kept troops in Saudi Arabia and throughout the Middle East in order to prevent Iraq from, invading again. Well, in 2001, and we're going to talk about this in our next lesson, the United States decides to, in 2003, the United States goes to war with Iraq again, which is the second Gulf War. and we're going to talk about that next week. This is George H.W. Bush. He was the president at the time, and you can see kind of some pictures from the first Iraqi war, the first Gulf War. Okay? And the final thing we're going to talk about is this thing called the Y2K bug. Right? And this is kind of a weird thing. So when computers are designed, when they were designed in the 70s, there's special programming that goes on the computer. And one of the things that computers really need to do to work properly is to keep up with the date. Well, nobody thought that it was necessary to make it so your computer could read 3-digit years. Because we're like, well, if it's 97, we know it's 1997. If it's 85, we know it's 1985. But when your computer sees 00, for example, on January 1st, 2000, well, your computer didn't know, well, back then, whether or not it was the year 1900 or the year 2000. And so now all of a sudden, people were scrambling to try to figure out how can they fix these problems. And there were all sorts of rumors that computers were going to stop working, satellites and planes would fall out of the skies, ATM machines would start spitting out money, and it would be a disaster. So people all over the world, companies, governments, spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to fix this problem. And luckily, on January 1st, 2000, there were actually very few problems. And the ones that did pop up were very minor. Alarms accidentally going off and things like that. So the Y2K bug, we remember it as a kind of time we overreacted, but had we not, maybe something worse would have happened. Okay? So that is what I have for you today as far as notes goes. As far as class goes, you're going to continue working on the thing that you worked on last time. And I'm going to go ahead and post, I'll repost the directions for you for lesson 12, but Monday and Tuesday of this week, so the 18th and 19th, you worked on the 1980s. Well, now you're going to work on the 1990s, and I've got more events for you. And again, remember, you're answering these questions concerning these events, okay? So you are still allowed to work with whoever you want. I want you to use the same slides that you used last time. So by now, you should have the 80s information filled out, and now you're going to do the same thing with the 90s here, okay? So if you got any questions, you know how to reach out to me, jvians at wcpss.net, and I will see you guys later.